This week we've been walking through a couple of well-known miracles that Jesus performed that are recorded in the Gospel of John. And by looking at these miracles, we're focusing on how Jesus can change and improve even the most hopeless of situations. And tonight, we're going to wrap up this week's series that's called HEALER. Now tonight we're going to look at a time when Jesus raised a man from the dead. At this point in John's account of the Gospel, Jesus had been preaching and teaching in Jerusalem and also in an area in wilderness near the Jordan River. Now Jesus had been teaching his followers that he and God the Father were one, that he and Yahweh were one and the same. Now making a claim to be God is a big deal, and the Jewish leaders were angry, and they tried to stone him and arrest him for blasphemy. But other people began to believe. Because of John the Baptist's claims of the Messiah, people believed that was coming true in Jesus. So we find ourselves in an interesting part of the story. Jesus' ministry is continuing to impact more and more people. Some are finally grasping who he is, and that's making people nervous. We're going to pick it up in John chapter 11. A certain man, Lazarus, was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus saying, "Lord, the one whom you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness is not fatal. It's for the glory of God so that God's Son can be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. When he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. And after 2 days, he says to his disciples, "Let's return to Judea." The disciples replied, "Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you, but you want to go back?" Now it's clear that Jesus has some history with this family, because in just those few verses we read a couple of times that he loves each one of them. But let's pay close attention to Jesus' actions right after he hears about Lazarus being sick. He basically says, well, he'll be okay. And then Jesus just hangs out where he's at, which would have made complete sense to the disciples, because the last time they had been in Jerusalem and Judea, the temple leaders were ready to attack Jesus. But then, after 2 days, he says to them, it's time to go check on Lazarus. And at that point, he and the disciples have a bit of discussion. Essentially, the disciples tell Jesus that it's too late for Lazarus. Why would they go back into a dangerous situation if he's more than likely already dead? Jesus' disciples warn him, but he stays the course. We'll pick it up in verse 17. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was a little less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to comfort Mary and Martha after their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet with him, while Mary remained in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you." And Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha replied, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Now imagine that meeting between Martha and Jesus. She sent word to Jesus for help, but he waited to respond. What do you think she would have been feeling in that moment? But she still has faith enough and tells Jesus that she knows her brother will be raised into heaven through Jesus. And so Jesus asks a little deeper, and he asks if Martha still has faith through him that they will never die. And even in the midst of her grieving the loss of her brother, she says that she still believes that. Think about that. Even in the most incredibly hopeless situation, her brother had just died, yet she still remains grounded in her belief in Jesus. Now after this exchange, Martha goes back and tells her sister Mary that Jesus has arrived. And Mary has some words with Jesus. And in front of her brother's tomb, she tells Jesus that if he had come right when they sent for him, Lazarus might still be here. Now you may have heard this story before, but think through Mary's reaction. I think it's completely justified that she's upset, because she's in the midst of a completely hopeless situation, and she knows that Jesus is the ultimate healer, but he didn't come soon enough. And because of his delayed response, her brother died and has been laid in a tomb. Now at this point, there's a large crowd gathered around the tomb, both followers of Jesus and non-followers. And after this interaction with Mary, Jesus starts to cry. And the people in the crowd judge Jesus, thinking that if he really was who he says he is, then if he had just come, he would have kept all of this from happening. But through his tears, Jesus tells them, "Remove the stone from Lazarus' tomb." And the crowd is stunned and warns Jesus that the smell coming out of there will be awful. We'll pick the story back up in verse 41. So they removed the stone, and Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me. I say this for the benefit of the crowd standing here, so they will believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied, and his face covered with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who came with Mary and saw what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Now imagine you were standing in that crowd. A dead man walks out of his tomb. It's unthinkable. In a beautiful foreshadowing of his own fate, Jesus raises a man that had been dead for days back to life. Think about the implications of this story. Jesus is a healer, yes. He's already demonstrated that several times. In just 2 chapters earlier, what we talked about on Tuesday, he healed a blind man with mud. But this story shows us that Jesus has more than just power to heal the living. He shows us that his healing power extends into the most hopeless situations, even beyond the grave. In the story of Lazarus, Jesus says that I am the resurrection and the life, and one day I will cause all of those who believe in me to live. And then he turns around and proves it right then, and he raises a dead man back to life. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of a more hopeless situation than death. But Jesus' healing power defeats even that. Now, right now, we're all walking through our own difficult situations. And this pandemic has impacted more things than we can list or more things than we can comprehend. And because of its impact, there are going to be some very broken and difficult situations that might feel hopeless. But this miracle teaches us that we have to remember that there's nothing too broken. There's nothing too hopeless for Jesus. Hear this tonight. You are loved and pursued by a healer whose power even death can't hold back. And in the midst of the questions and the chaos around you today, find your hope in the healer who is bigger than it all. Amen.